and thank you for joining us again here at Dubitandum. I'm Brandon,
I'm Commodore.
and we're going to be discussing a topic today that we came across just kind of by accident, but it struck us as being really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely this is definitely one of the videos that applies more to your own life.
Yeah,
like our previous ones, like logic and whatnot.
Yeah.
That one you could go your entire life without really thinking about that one.
Yeah.
It may not really have a huge effect.
Yeah, this is more about actual application to the way we live our lives and the way we value our lives. And
Yeah, definitely.
so the topic is, as the title would suggest, is anti-natalism. Anti-natalism is a set of beliefs advocated by, the premier philosopher that I've encountered who advocates it is a man named David Benatar. I came across it in the context of listening to a debate between him and Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson. In that debate, they discussed the idea as to whether or not life is so fundamentally wretched that it is better to not exist. And if that is the case, whether or not it is actively immoral to have children and actively moral to abstain from having children.
I don't remember how to say this guy's name.
Which one?
I also had a philosopher I found.
Who?
For once. It's a I think it's Argentinian philosopher. Maybe that's how you say this. I don't know. I could be wrong on that. His name's like Julio Cabrera.
Julio Cabrera.
Thank you.
Yeah, I looked him up too. He is one of the...
He had a whole thing on negative ethics.
Yeah.
And like something I found
Mm-hmm.
touched on that as applied to anti-natalism.
Yeah.
In fact, the one I looked at had a local anti-natalism, and then there's like a global version. And
Yeah.
then the negative ethics. I don't know if you were going to touch on those.
I think we should.
Okay.
I think we are going to touch on those. Let me lay out, as I understand it, some of the core points of anti-natalism, and then we'll just kind of take it from there. How's that?
Yeah, that sounds
All
fine.
right. So, as I understand it, and my contact with anti-natalism really stems from interviews and speeches by David Benatar, a couple of writings from Julio Cabrera, and a bunch of YouTube comments. So there's a few fundamental premises that I've been able to identify in anti-natalism. Premise one is that conscious life is bad. So, maybe the life of oak trees is morally neutral. They don't feel pain or pleasure or anything.
At least as we define.
Yeah.
Like, I would like to stress that there are people that might believe they do, but there's also like the idea that they don't have the same consciousness we do. So it's hard to stress that. But still, if we accept the fact that they don't feel.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, philosophy, of course, should never shy away from embracing what the sciences bring into us. And certainly scientific investigation has led to the, I think, indubitable conclusion that the only indicator for a high probability that complex consciousness is present is for some form of complex nervous system.
Yeah.
And
I would at least argue that there is some kind of there's more of a response. Like you should be able to that's probably hard to say. But generally, at least as we have in front of us, the only way we can probably test is that something has to have a response to something that we do. Now, there's a limit to that, but even so, like there's technically, I don't know why I know this. Just so this is off the beaten path, and I might edit it out. But there is a fern that when you touch it, it reacts.
Oh, yeah.
If you drop it, it also reacts.
Yeah.
But if you drop it continuously, it gets used to falling. So then it learns.
Yeah.
So with that knowledge, there's obviously enough there to say that it gets used to falling.
Well, it gets...
But I don't know if that applies to the metaphor you're creating.
Well,
and
it
I don't
kind of
know-
depends on how you define knowledge.
Yeah.
Is knowledge a physical structure or is knowledge a cognitive structure?
Yeah.
So like, and knowledge could be either. I shy away from saying that like a plant has knowledge. So I have knowledge on how to ride a bicycle. This was Bertrand Russell's example when talking about knowledge. I have knowledge of how to ride a bicycle. Now, I couldn't really explain to you how to ride one. Like I could say, oh, you sit in the seat and you pedal and you go forward, but I can't explain the micro muscle adjustments that it takes to stay balanced.
And like you might loosely explain like the feeling of balance.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Whatever, which has its own perspective, which each one of us.
So you could argue that my knowledge on how to ride a bike is embodied more as an embodied structure more than a cognitive structure, versus my knowledge that 55 plus 5 equals 60, that, you know, that doesn't come from a embodied physical structure. I mean, aside from the premise that the structure of our brains and neurons has something to do with our cognition, my knowledge that 55 plus 5 equals 60 is not an embodied physical knowledge. It's cognitive knowledge about the manipulation of logical interactions.
And so I know that I derailed this a little, but back to the path is that I guess the premise is that life is inherently bad.
Conscious life is inherently bad.
Yes.
So, as an anti-natalist would state it, and I'll try to make a decent case for it briefly before laying out the three main points that as I see them. They would say that suffering is wrong. Suffering is morally wrong. So if you see someone suffering, it's morally wrong to just turn your head away and let them suffer. And it's, of course, morally wrong to make someone suffer on purpose.
Yeah.
You should do all in your power to alleviate unnecessary suffering. They would also then say that suffering is unavoidable in life. And, you know, no argument there from me.
I also accept that.
Yeah. Then they would say that the suffering in one form or another outweighs its opposite. Now, it's easy to start to put it in hedonistic terms like pleasure versus pain.
It definitely immediately starts pushing that way with how it's explained.
Yeah. But now
there's some, I mean,
Benatar tries to assert that he's not, and I don't want to get too far off on this yet, but we'll grant them the benefit of the doubt that when they say that there's a preponderance of suffering in the world, that they're not using just a base, simplistic, hedonic calculus.
I assume it's more of a global, universal. I think is a better
term.
So like, it isn't just the suffering of you're going to have pain, growing pains as you grow, and that's suffering. It's also including like the moment when your reaction, you know, dealing with other people, somebody's gonna break your heart or hurt you physically, or you know have. I mean, there's just gonna be situations where things are gonna happen, and some of those can be portrayed as negative.
Yes,
and cause.
So you can say there's more bad than good.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is that the argument is that there's more bad than good, or I've actually seen it argued that there's at least an equal amount of bad and good, and the idea that there is good and bad isn't better than there being neither. Because the fact that like non-existence would have neither, so it wouldn't have any bad at all. So non-existent existence would be preferred. Yeah, because it just complete absence of that.
Yeah, so that ties right in with the fundamental anti-natalist claim is that the structure of being, at least conscious being, is such that the bad, however you define it, and whatever it consists in, outweighs the good, or is even present. But fundamentally, both of those things arrive at the same conclusion, which is it would be better to have never existed, because no suffering is preferable to a life where there's either an equal amount of suffering and not suffering, or a disproportionate amount of suffering compared to not suffering.
Yeah, and like there was a whole. I remember you talking about it as the guy didn't seem to back up his argument very well. Was my understanding.
I'm not going to get to saying that about him just yet. There's one more thing I wanted to say, but no, I think he actually did a really bad job.
It just happens. I mean, nobody's. That's kind of the thing we've got going here. Is like this isn't scripted. So like,
yeah, no,
we could do horrible jobs trying to explain.
We are doing a horrible job.
We're pretty stupid.
We're really dumb.
That's the point. You start somewhere.
So the conclusion, of course, from all this is not just that it would be better if I didn't exist. They extrapolate that to it is morally better to not have children. And you could go one of a couple different ways with that. You could either go the strong route and say that it is morally good to refrain from having children, or you could go the weaker route and just say that it's morally better that children not be brought into the world. And there's a minor difference there in terms of intent.
Yeah.
So, like it would basically make it the case that it's morally better to be able to have children and choose not to than to just happen to never have children.
Yeah, and that's like it's a hard question because a lot of people want to have their own kids.
Yeah.
So they're going to initially like walk into that with a conclusion already founded.
Let me just say, full disclosure, I actively do not want to have children. My girlfriend and I have discussed it. We don't want kids. We don't want them. We're not mystified by them. The little shits aren't the most sparkling, beautiful, wondrous things in the world. So I say all this to make sure that everyone knows I am not looking at life as though it is this beautiful, precious thing. I mean, you know, it is full of suffering. You're brought into the world. You're just there. You're, as Heidegger would put it, you are thrown into existence.
Yeah.
And
we could both agree that there's some truth to that. It's not like that I can't remember, of course, but there's not like I have any way to know that I had a choice in this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to argue that it isn't fundamentally existentially bizarre how life works, because, you know, you are just thrown into existence. You're born and raised in the midst of horror, like endless death and suffering and war and violence in the world around us.
Of course. Now, see, this is where me and Brandon differ. From my viewpoint, he comes off very pessimistic.
No, really?
And I have a couple. Him and a few coworkers are of equal. Some would call themselves realist. Yeah. Anyway,
pessimistic realism or depressive realism.
Yeah. I, on the other hand, have some sort of. I'm usually more optimistic. I've
just a disease, if you ask me.
Yeah. So I've just inherently always been more positive. I don't know. I get excited easily. I ride the wave of any small feat for hours at a time. Yeah. But regardless, there's been times in my life where I've wanted to have kids. Mm-hmm. Right now, I'm glad I don't. Yeah. And there's times that I don't want to deal with other people's kids most of the time. Yeah. So I'm really more on the fence about this. Like Brandon, he's at least made the choice to not have kids, so he seems where he is. You know, I'm not saying that I've not disclosing his opinion on the situation. I'm just saying where he is right now. He's decided not to have kids. Yeah. I am on the fence. Like I could see myself having kids, not anytime soon. Yeah. I got nobody in my life to do it with. So
I just wanted to state for the record how opposed to having kids personally I am, so that no one, because I'm going to lean into this argument because I really think that it rests on some terrible arguments. Anti-natalism does.
Yes, I agree.
I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that this is not coming from the starstruck eyes of someone who just desperately wants to be a father someday. I don't. I just think that Benatar and others like him are mistaken. They're in the grip of bad reasoning.
Yeah.
And I might not love kids, but I do love good reasoning. And so that's what brings me to this, is the fact that I think it's bad reasoning
Yeah.
to
Which
draw
is-
these sweeping conclusions.
Yeah, which is a part of the point of this whole podcast and this whole thing that this is what we do for the philosophy.
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of having an argument that literally, yeah, you can have this opinion, but like your foundation's wrong. You need to give yourself a reason to believe it. It touches into a whole other thing that we'll touch on eventually about people's ideologies and having fallacies and
Yeah.
patchworked beliefs.
Yeah.
Which I think some people kind of jump to this because
Yeah.
of that.
So
But-
the future recording Commodore's referencing is eventually we're going to do a recording on crypto ideology, which is the idea that people don't have a coherent belief system. They just latch on to things that agree with and protect their ego.
Yeah.
And I think that it is easy, if you are a pessimistic or depressive or cynical person, to latch on to anti-natalism. Now, that's not an argument against it being
No.
true.
Hey, if it was, I mean, if you latching on to it because of predisposition isn't a reason to have a falsified argument.
Yeah.
You can totally latch onto things that I would completely support because
Yeah.
of the way whatever you grew up.
Yeah.
But this, on the other hand, I just don't think it gets.
So I guess let's go ahead
Yeah,
and
let's jump into this one.
let me divide it up into three fundamental claims that I think they're making. I think that, well, let me think for just a quick second. There's a claim that, all right, there's a claim that, okay, and there's a claim. All right, so the first claim they make is, as I see it, that there is more bad in the world than good. Now, I know you brought up the more nuanced view, which is bad and good might be equal, but nothing is still preferable to any amount of bad. And I want to tack that on towards the end, because I've really...
I like starting with the idea that there's the opinion, because I mean that was like
That's the strong one. Yeah.
The strong opinion
Yeah.
is that the world, it's unbalanced.
Yeah,
It's not equal. There is more bad than
than
good.
So I'm not usually the kind of person that goes in for practical arguments, but if you're going to make a sweeping moral claim that states that it is resolutely morally wrong to bring children into existence and morally good to choose to refrain from doing that, I think that you'd better have a really good way of adequately presenting how you're measuring good versus bad. So let's start from the top here. Functionally, I think that a lot of Benatar's arguments do boil down to just assertions of hedonism or hedonic calculus. So hedonism is, of course, the idea that the only good in the world is pleasure and the only bad in the world is pain, to grossly oversimplify it. And hedonic calculus is just that, crunching the numbers to determine if something's more pleasurable than not.
Yeah.
So,
Which there's already problems. Problems with this.
Yeah. So, in the debate between Peterson and Benatar, the way Benatar frames his argument, as I listened to it, even when he asserted that he was not using a hedonic calculus, it seemed to me that he was. So, for example, in one instance, when Peterson pushes him to give a non-pleasure versus pain account of why the world is full of more bad than good, Benatar says something to the effect of, well, knowledge exists, it's a good. And Peterson asks, well, why is knowledge a good? And Benatar says, well, it's a good because it increases our understanding of the world. But knowledge is difficult to come by and easy to lose. You know, you could spend years and years studying to become a master in some realm of knowledge, only to have a stroke wipe your brain clean of that knowledge overnight, or to suffer the onset of dementia or Alzheimer's and see your knowledge eradicated. And Benatar says that because knowledge is good and the loss of knowledge is bad, that's a case of non-hedonistic good and bad. And right there, I think that I think that example is such a pristine case of where I see a lot of anti-natalists go wrong, which is they use these extremely vague ideas of good or bad. It kind of makes me think that, and I don't like this line of reasoning in myself. I try to address the argument, not the psychology of the person. But at a certain point, I do think it bears mentioning. And this is one of those cases. It seems to me almost like the psychology of people who strongly support antinatalism. It's people who are psychologically highly sensitive to any perceived suffering. And they can't get over it. It stands out to them like a blinding light. And their eyes just can't adjust to the suffering and move on. Mm-hmm. Versus someone who I think is more well constituted in their will to power, who can experience suffering, appreciate it in all its horror, and then recover and move on. But that's, I guess, somewhat of a separate case. So backing up, when Benatar says, oh, well, knowledge is a good, and Peterson presses him, well, why is knowledge a good? He says, well, it increases our understanding of the world. Well, that's just a different way of phrasing what knowledge is taken to be. Knowledge,
I mean, he pretty much said the same.
Yeah, it was
essentially the same thing twice.
It's a tautology. It's like saying, I'm a bachelor. And then someone says, well, why are you a bachelor? And you say, oh, I'm an unmarried man. You know, when you understand the definition of the term, it becomes a tautology. So if someone says, well, why is knowledge good? And you say, well, knowledge is good because it helps us increase our understanding of the world. You've essentially just said knowledge is good because it's knowledge. And that tells us nothing. It's a tautology.
Yeah. And like, because then the question, if you go deeper, it's like, why do we need to understand? Like, what is good about understanding the world more?
Exactly.
You know, it just opens another question.
Exactly. And I think that if you push people down that road, what I think you're going to hear, and I could be surprised and wrong about this, but I think you're going to hear things like, well, with greater knowledge, we are better able to alleviate suffering, like understanding how pain receptors work allows us to create medicines to counter pain. And it's like, aha, there's that hedonic calculus again, reducing good and bad to pleasure versus pain.
And
so I think that pleasure versus pain is the shark that is always close enough to the surface of these arguments for its fin to be seen.
Another note about this pleasure versus pain algorithm versus not calculate. It's just, the problem is you can't use it as an argument if you can't calculate, in my opinion. And personally, the skeptical problem, like the skeptical viewpoint of this whole thing, is that you cannot predict if a life is going to be more or less suffering and pain versus pleasure.
Yeah.
Like you cannot conceivably predict that right now.
Yeah.
We don't have the if you would have to have some kind of futuristic, time machine, maybe it's some kind of looking glass that lets you scan over the person's potential life. And once again, still only the potential, because if
they don't exist yet.
So like it could go other ways. Maybe there is another way to do this, but anyway, so you'd have to be able to analyze the entire future life based off some information, and then discern from that if it's actually good or bad to do it in the situation. There'd be no way to know.
I think that there's two problems with Benatar wanting to say that life has more bad in it than good. Number one, how are we crunching the numbers for good versus bad? So if I go on a really good date with my girlfriend, we go out to a nice restaurant, we have a lovely conversation, we have great food, and we have a pleasant walk afterwards and then go home. How many good events just happened? Was it one good event of the date? Or was it one good event of having a great conversation and one good event of having a wonderful meal and one good event of having a nice walk? Or if the meal was really delicious, was it 40 individual good events, each one being a delicious bite of the meal? And if the conversation was really great, was it, say, 1,000 individual good events of the back and forth statements in the conversation? How are you quantifying good units versus bad units?
Of course.
Benatar, in his debate with Peterson, says, oh, I don't have to quantify it in terms of units. I can just state that qualitatively there's more bad than good. And yeah, you can assert that.
Yeah.
But if your conclusion is going to be the sweeping condemnation of the furtherance of the species, having a vague intuition coupled by a shrug doth not a great argument make. Because if that's all the qualifications we're going to go with, you could have someone who is bubbly and optimistic come along and assert that, no, really, there's more good to life than bad.
Yeah, your entire argument is the foundation of his argument from this viewpoint, from what we've got, is a viewpoint. It's just his perspective.
Yeah, writ large.
I mean, like, and even if it's so easy to just jump all over that skeptically, because like there's just not enough information here to support the idea.
And I mean, a lot of what Benatar was saying and a lot of the comments in the YouTube posts following that debate were people just essentially agreeing, like, yeah, it's obvious there's more suffering in life than good. There's more bad than good.
Like, first off, I don't fully trust my own perspective. I try to be as open-minded, like, I try to be open-minded as it gets. But, like, you got, like, just making the comment that you automatically know that there's more trouble in life. Do you realize that, like, most of the things we watch in the news are all bad because they get better views? So, like, maybe that's why these people are thinking that the life is terrible, is because they're drawn more, like, the negative feels more powerful than the positive. Yeah. Maybe that might even be an argument to say that the life is more bad. But,
well, I mean, the way I look at it is this.
It's just difficult.
Number one, yes, you can qualitatively make proportionate judgments. So if you were to show me a swimming pool full of water and a cup full of water, I don't know how many ounces more are in the swimming pool, but I can intuitively and qualitatively tell that there's more water in the swimming pool than there is in the cup. So in that sense, I'm somewhat friendly to people saying there's more bad in life than good. And here's the kicker. If your argument is that life by and large is shitty, I agree with you. I agree with you.
Let's be honest here.
But if you're going to move from that to rigid moral calculations about the intrinsic rightness or wrongness of an action, in this case, bringing a child into the world, now I'm going to want to see your quantifications in addition to your qualifications. If you want to meet with me for coffee and just bitch about the state of the world in kind of a vague existentialist way, I'm game.
Yeah, literally, like I've heard Brandon get into those. It's normal. Like, he enjoys this.
And so I do think that there is something to be said for the argument, but when you try to then say,
it's morally wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
To have kids based on that kind of...
We can go back to the pool of water versus cup of water. So imagine we're looking at a pool of water and a cup of water. You know that there is more water in the pool than the cup. And someone says, well, you should have more than 8 ounces of water per day, and the cup is small and the pool is huge. You can kind of intuitively tell that the cup doesn't have a full 8 ounces and there's more than 8 ounces in the pool. So simplistic logic that's really not taking into account problems of measurement or problems of qualitative analysis, would lead you to the obviously preposterous conclusion that if the cup looks too small to have 8 ounces of water in it, and the pool intuitively looks like it definitely has more than 8 ounces, you should drink the pool instead of the cup. Of course, if you did that, you'd die of water poisoning.
Yeah.
You'd get sick, or you couldn't do it. You'd drown. So the claim that there's more bad in life than good, I'm friendly to that claim. But when you try to make a prescriptive judgment on that, now I want to see how you're measuring.
Yeah, like, okay, I just had this thought. Now, a note you gave me when you introduced me to this idea was utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Now, with that, it's like you want to do actions that are for the best maximum good. Yeah, and a lot of utilitarians go on a more of a long-term thing.
Yeah.
So you could argue that because a life may be bad, perhaps that brings about a good to others, though. Maybe that's the whole other side of this argument.
Yeah,
it just jumps in because because life itself may be more bad than good as it stands right now. What's to say another life, even that life that might be bad, like throughout time, like by the end of it,
could contribute more good units.
more good. It would debase the fact that that person could even have a shitty, horrible life through their whole life, be constantly suffering. But if that person brings more to the world, then therefore it's a suffering that they should bear from a utilitarian viewpoint.
Yeah, and anti-natalism, I think, is fundamentally utilitarian, not in a group sense.
Okay.
I think it's utilitarian in like an individualistic sense.
Yeah.
So they're saying that the greater good, well, actually, maybe you could make the argument that it's in the group sense because the group of potential people is vastly larger than the group of actual people. And so
of course.
Yeah, and so if the greater good is
so
served,
of dead people too.
Yeah, the dead people outnumber us by quite a bit.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So
anyway,
but I guess I want to back up for a second though, and just and try to close the book on the argument that there's more bad in life than good. Qualitatively, yes, you can get away with saying that.
I mean, personally, I think it all matters from perspective.
That's true. So there is a problem even with me saying you can get away with it.
Even because personally, I'm naturally optimistic. So a lot of times I can easily jump on yeah, sure, maybe there's more bad in the world. But personally, my life could be a lot worse if I just wanted it to be.
If we're just going based on the subjective experience projected at large, then if you rounded up enough optimists, you'd have to conclude, well, I just can't decide if there's more bad in the world or good because you've got 1,000 people in one room saying more bad than good. You've got 1,000 optimists in the other room saying more good than bad. So
it becomes that's whenever you practically have to break out the calculator.
Exactly. And now even if you do the whole unit calculus thing, which is preposterous,
it's insane.
There's no rational way without a bunch of just brute assertions that beg the question to come up with a good calculus for good units and bad units. So imagine I go through my day and I have 500 bad units that happen to me in a day. I stub my toe, I have a flat tire, I have a bad day at work, which I can't help but harp on this. There again, if I have a bad day of work, is that one bad unit? Or is it 8 bad units, each one being an hour of work? Or is each individual action I'm doing at work a bad unit?
Or do you have to do it in a measurement of time, like every second of bad? It's
exactly.
It gets insane. And as much, I kind of hate using the argument that it's incalculable.
Yeah, but it is.
It is. It's completely, because you have to know the future and you have to be able to recalculate everything that's happened.
And here's the thing.
And it's based off...
Usually, if you try to say an argument is bunk because of calculation problems, I'll be the first person to argue with you.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that pragmatic quantification is always a good refutation of an argument. Yeah. But if you're going to get around to making normative claims and rigid moral designations like, we figured out there's more bad in the world than good, ergo, it is morally wrong for you to have a child and morally good for you to refrain from having a child. Now you're not doing the subjective qualitative analysis game anymore. Now you're playing the real, practical, pragmatic, I'm giving you imperatives to carry out or refrain from carrying out. So, number one, I think that anti-natalism needs to get serious about how it's going to qualify and quantify good versus bad. Because on the one hand, I think that its qualifications usually reduce down to just simplistic hedonic calculus, and that's a question begging for a certain form of moral evaluation that we don't have time to get into. Or it comes apart at the seams with this preposterous question of how do we evaluate units of good versus units of bad. So there's the
Now,
first principle.
The one thing we haven't touched on yet is the idea that non-existence is just intrinsically better because there's no bad.
Yeah.
Which I think is I'm looking at my notes here, and the idea is that it's skeptical that it is actually better.
Yeah.
Because, like, first off, it's hard to define. Nobody's sitting in non-existence going, "Oh yeah, it's great."
Yeah, exactly.
That's a huge problem.
I think it's actively irrational and illogical to say that non-existence is preferable to existence.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let me correct that. Because I think that there are times where suicide is legitimate. So if you've got, like, a 9/11, the people who were going to burn to death,
Yeah, like
when they chose to jump.
That's the thing is like the negative ethics thing was the question should be begged that should we live rather than how should we live?
Yeah.
And one part of it is that it's the knowledge of your impending doom would be worth, like, it's a negative value towards the value of life.
Yeah, I mean, there again,
And
this is,
personally, I think it's kind of ridiculous.
yeah, this is why it's so hard for me to refrain from wanting to psychoanalyze the people who are drawn to this kind of argument, because to me, that screams, I'm a person who is psychologically unable to handle suffering. And so things like the knowledge of death bother me to a point where it seems like no one should be able to function.
Yeah, because, like, honestly, if you accept this as your philosophy of life, that non-existence is better because either the doom is going to happen, you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
If that is worth so much to you that it outweighs existence, that honestly begs a lot of questions. It seems like a more internal problem.
It does. And I guess, well, here's to me another problem with saying that
maybe a little much,
non-existence. Huh?
I'm just thinking that my viewpoint may be extreme on that, but, like,
Oh, no.
I mean, it's coming off a little biased. Like, I personally think people should be alive.
Well, but here's the thing. This is just
I wanna be alive.
This is just a case of bias versus bias.
Yeah, I agree.
In a way. Now,
No,
all right, so let me back up, because this does touch on something. They would say that you're biased to wanting to stay alive, but the non-born, the unexisting, are not biased towards staying alive, so it's an act of kindness to them to never bring them into existence, because then they're going to suffer, and they're going to have the biological imperative to stay alive and keep suffering. To that, I would say that I think we're making some pretty big category errors when we say things like, it is in the best interest of those who don't exist. Those who don't exist are not within the category of things who have best interests. The one thing I do want to say about category distinctions is that it's not so much about saying that it's better to not exist. It's that non-existence becomes a category where things like better or good and bad just don't apply.
Yeah. And we're saying that, like, that's the other thing. It's like, there's a whole argument you talked about briefly before we talked about this, that there's something about humans that you have to have bad things happen to fully be able to appreciate good things. That's something that I personally firmly believe. I know that in my own life.
Same.
That I've been through some things that I would not be able to appreciate the outcomes or personal or my current condition.
Same.
Without being through them. So there's a certain level of like, bad has to happen. So to say that life shouldn't exist because it could have bad in it is absurd.
Yeah.
Because then a life with only good in it would be worthless.
I think it's a childish fantasy.
Yeah.
It's almost like a child saying that it is akin in terms of childish fantasy and naivete to say that because life has bad in it, it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
I think to a child saying that because eventually I will run out of cake, it's not even worth it to have the first bite.
Yeah, exactly. How is that different from the argument? It's more personal. You're not, like, bringing whole life in and you've got all this responsibility. But it really isn't that different. The idea that, like, essentially, if you apply this to procreation, why not apply this to other areas of your life?
Yeah.
Why not apply this to being existing at all?
Yeah.
You're all of a sudden you're saying that any hurt,
Yeah.
breaking a fingernail, would then become is the same amount as, being killed or just anything you can imagine.
It does put it on, I would say, not quite that, but I do think that they put it on a sliding scale of the same evaluation.
Yeah,
So
like-
any bad thing goes onto the sliding scale of evaluation that tips it against being.
Yes. Against being. I'm not saying that would change the value of good. I'm saying that, like, anything bad makes life worth less than not life.
Yeah, I think that
I think it's just kind of absurd, my personal opinion.
I agree. I think that there's a couple things that we don't have time for right now, but I do want to just mention them. Number one, I think that there's something to be said for it being a category, because another argument they make is that bodily autonomy is good and should never be violated, and that to give birth to someone and create them is to violate their bodily autonomy because they had no say in it. Now, I don't think bodily autonomy should always be honored. So if someone decides to exercise their bodily autonomy in a certain way, say by being violent towards me, I'm perfectly okay saying, in this instance, it's okay to violate their bodily autonomy by restraining them and keeping them from harming me.
Yeah, that's kind of a mess.
So I think that number one, it relies on a way of evaluating good things like bodily autonomy without nuance, so that you can't distinguish between valid instances of bodily autonomy being denied versus invalid instances of bodily autonomy being denied. And I think that if you think about it for more than 5 minutes, you'll realize that there are cases to be made for people either forcibly being denied some bodily autonomy or being enculturated to deny some bodily autonomy. Like, you've got to teach a person over the course of many years that it's rude to just take someone else's food. So you've got to drill it into their head to violate their own autonomy and override their own base drives.
Yeah.
And not just grab food off someone else's plate.
Yeah, it's essentially the nature that, it's utilitarian in a way to violate your own bodily autonomy for the benefit of others.
Yeah, yeah.
So bodily autonomy shouldn't be used. I probably said it funny right there, but anyway, it shouldn't be used in a universal, like, grounding rule.
Simplistic sense. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously.
I dare say that nothing should, and even though that's kind of a generalization,
we like
itself,
to say really daring things.
Yeah. But I mean, anytime you take a certain principle and you say, well, this here is completely inviolable, it is an absolute moral good, and it applies everywhere, at all times, in all places, and in all ways, you've set yourself up for absurdisms.
Yeah.
So, and this, I don't have time to go too deep into this, but I do want to talk about it someday. Maybe when we get to talking about modal logic. But the assertion that it is against the bodily autonomy of a unborn individual to give birth to them, I think is a category error, because bodily autonomy applies to those things for whom bodies and autonomy are applicable categories. So we don't care about the bodily autonomy of a blade of grass, because even though it is a body, it is an object, an organic living object at that, it's not the kind of thing that even could have preferences about being stepped on or not stepped on.
And it's more here than something that someone.
Yeah, it's actually
here. Doesn't exist.
It exists.
So,
now, the person who only hypothetically exists, because they're not an actualized human being, I think that it's a category error to apply, at least with the same moral weight, the concept of bodily autonomy to that person. Now, once they begin to exist, now we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
About bodily autonomy. Now, I still don't think that, well, that's going to get more into the topic of abortion, which should be its own podcast.
Without bringing that up.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
But the bottom line is applying notions like compassion and respect for bodily autonomy to things that don't exist, I think is a prime example of a category error.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be like me saying I feel very sorry for my unborn hypothetical older brother. If you add intention and time, I think that you actually get in some interesting positions where it starts to be more rational to talk about doing things out of compassion for those who don't yet exist, because they're on their way towards it. So if you plan on having a child,
yeah, that's different.
And the child doesn't exist yet, but time is moving towards that existence,
yeah,
then I think you can say things coherently like, well, for the sake of my eventual child, I'm going to start a college trust fund.
Yeah, that makes complete. That's called planning.
Yeah. Versus,
You know?
Now,
I mean, so is the child planning, but like versus like, you know, something that doesn't exist at all
and won't exist, and you talking about it
Yeah.
as if it had best interests.
Yeah.
So it'd be like if you were like, I'm going to have a kid in a few months, so I'd better start saving for a college trust fund, and then something changes, you're not going to have the child, and now you say, well, it'd be wrong to take money out of their trust fund.
And then that would also, like, if you give reason for autonomy to something that doesn't exist, then it make, in that example, making the trust fund, if you were then to have another kid, it would be wrong to take it away from the first kid.
Yeah, because it's like, oh, well, that trust fund was meant for my first child who doesn't exist, but because it's wrong to steal, I'm not going to take money from that trust fund to give to my current child that does exist.
It gets a little silly when we pull it that far, but it definitely...
But I think that there's a reason it gets silly, and that's because it's a fundamentally irrational situation.
Yeah, it's... God. Yeah. And then we didn't have... I think we're pretty close to time.
Yeah.
And I know that there's two topics that relate to this pretty straightforwardly, and that's the topic of abortion and the other A word, adoption.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're gonna do a full. We'll probably do a full one on abortion. That one, I've got some stuff on that because that thing is.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you can look up for days. In fact, I imagine that podcast, if it was put into the mix of things on the internet, you would have a hard time to find it without looking for us first.
Yeah.
Because it's just so much on that one topic.
Yeah.
Now, adoption. If we've got a moment here. I actually think that if you were somewhere in the middle of these two arguments that, against or for anti-natalism, adoption is a great alternative because it's a being that already exists. Like you don't have, like the action is already there.
Yeah.
So it's a
problem solved.
Yeah. You're done. Like literally adoption, from most viewpoints, it is better for a child to be raised than not raised. It's a great alternative. So if somebody is hard pressed into this, but maybe has the desire to raise another still, and finds it hard to have their own kids because of this viewpoint. If they've got grounding for it, that's a perfect option. It seems to be even you could argue towards it instead of having kids. In fact, because you're instead of bringing more lives into the world and. There's a billion things you could say about that. Yeah. You literally would be taking a life that's going one direction and try to take it another direction that would from all viewpoints be better.
Yeah, you'd be exercising your compassion and respect for an entity that actually exists.
Oh, and also on top of that, a lot of research has been done to say that statistically, I don't have anything to quote. I'm just going to start spewing stuff. I've heard it before that it's statistically beneficial. It's it's pretty common for kids that get adopted to actually even be better than a lot of other situations.
Well, I mean, I don't know anything.
But that's pushing a boundary that I probably shouldn't, because that's part of the problem with the previous assumptions is that they're pushing these boundaries, assuming that like the poor shouldn't have kids because they're poor and financially unable to do that, even though that kid could turn out to be a scientist that brings great change and cures cancer. And, you don't know the possibilities here. But from the viewpoint of just being raised by a family and being sent through a system or being unmentored, it would seem like almost unanimously beneficial to adopt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess in conclusion,
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. No, I agree.
Yeah.
If you're on the fence post and you want to be a parent, but you just don't know if you can bring yourself to bring a child into the world, there are already millions out there. So I do think that if you are in a position and you are financially able to adopt a child and give them a good life, and you want to, then, by all means.
I would also say this is something you need to genuinely examine. It's not like it's not like I'm telling you here, Brandon, that you should adopt because you already think kids are grubby and it looks like that would seem like it would be a force.
Yeah, I have no interest in it.
Yeah,
and
it doesn't seem beneficial to either party.
That's the other thing. And there is something to be said for the antinatalist claim about being careful. So there is something at least good to say about the observation that life, to put it technically, can be kind of shitty. And so if you are going to bring a life into the world, treat that decision with some weight. Think about how well can I care for this hypothetical person before they become a potential person, before they become an actualized person. Think about, well, can I provide for them? Am I in a safe and stable situation? There is something to be said for taking the observation that life is full of misery and then saying, well, I'm going to at least do what I can to not add more unnecessary misery to life.
There's definitely a ton of responsibility that comes to that situation. And that's something that I think it's common to be on both sides of that. It's common. I would argue it's common for people to find themselves with kids and without the decision of should I not.
They happen.
It happens. I mean, humans, part of our nature is to procreate.
Yeah.
It's just what it is. And the people need to consider everything when they get in that situation. So.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Again, we always look forward to and hope to get thoughts, comments, and constructive criticism. Feel free to leave those in the comment section below. Alternatively, feel free to write an essay, either responding towards or against something that was said today. Please keep essay lengths between 3 and 5 pages. They will be featured as a guest blog post. If you do not want your name listed with the essay, then also please make sure you specify that. So thank you very much for joining us again, and we look forward to our next conversation.